Oklahoma, Johnson voluntarily participated in twice-weekly drills with the local militia company. He was so enamored with the thoughts of war that when he was 15, he attempted to enlist with Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders to fight in the war against Spain. Foiled from becoming a child soldier by his father, Johnson nonetheless enrolled at West Point when he was just 17. Later, as an officer in the Army, he relished directing drills, roll calls, parades, reviews, and marches, and was known to scream at soldiers for the smallest violations of protocol. While serving in the Army, Johnson began a side career as a writer of short stories for magazines in which boys in the military learn discipline, loyalty, and self-sacrifice, and make themselves into men. Like Tugwell and many New Dealers, Johnson saw the Great War not as the worthless horror that most Americans considered it to be, but as a long-awaited opportunity to militarize all of American society. Because only 73,000 men volunteered for service in response to President Wilson's call to create an army of millions, the federal government was forced to institute the first peacetime draft since the Civil War. Several military leaders recognized that few people were better suited to the job of creating a vast army of conscripts than Johnson, and he was brought to Washington to implement the new selective service system. The registration of 10 million men for compulsory military service, which resulted in 5 million actually being shipped to training camps, 117,000 killed in action, and more than 200,000 wounded, was one of the most spectacular developments of the war, Johnson recalled. He also devised a plan to make useful the undrafted men, who stood in saloons and pool rooms watching their contemporaries marching away to war. All deferred men who were either unemployed or engaged in non-essential work were warned that they would be inducted into the military if they did not find work that was essential for the war effort. Johnson boasted that the work or fight order forced 137,255 bartenders, private chauffeurs, men hairdressers and the like that are pansies to take jobs that the government considered essential. During the 1920s, Johnson retreated into the private sector, waiting for the world to turn in favor of the martial life. In 1932, at the bottom of the Depression, Johnson saw his chance. He wrote a plan of action and circulated it privately among friends in the Democratic Party, with the heading, "By Mussolini, Dictator pro tem." Johnson's proclamation called for him to assume the dictatorship of the Republic. The time was right to do away with democracy. In this time of crisis, and especially in this political year, divided powers were wholly inadequate, he wrote. The sole cure was singleness of control and immediate action. He demanded that the President, Vice President, and all members of Congress be removed from the country and that elections be suspended. 1 month after writing his proclamation, Johnson was invited into the inner circle of the Roosevelt campaign. He later recalled that, from the principle of taking active charge of events through several of the principal acts that were found to be necessary more than 8 months later, Mussolini pretty accurately diagnosed the situation and at least dimly anticipated much of the recovery program. When it came time to draft the National Industrial Recovery Act, Johnson successfully argued for the President, alone rather than Congress, to have supervisory power over the trade associations. When the act was passed, Roosevelt, perhaps out of gratitude, made Johnson the first administrator of the NRA. By then, Johnson had discovered the writings of the Italian fascists. He distributed books written by Mussolini's education minister to other members of the Roosevelt cabinet, and in a speech called the Italian dictator the shining example of the 20th century. Johnson brought in Donald Richburg, a progressive labor lawyer who helped craft the NIRA, to be the general counsel of the NRA. Richburg recalled that the drafting of the law grew out of a desire to end parliamentary democracy and establish autocratic rule in America. America did not want to reform its bad habits, he said, and someone has to do it for the people. America is not going to choose to do anything which a large number of Americans do not wish to do, so long as democratic government can endure and politicians can evade a perilous issue. Richburg wrote. What he called the inefficiencies and corruptions of popular government were replaced by a single leader. We called for a man of action, and we got one. The American people might well go down upon their knees and thank God that there came into power the man who alone could save them, the man of action. As the legal historian James Q. Whitman puts it, the two leaders of the NIRA were marked anti-parliamentarians, the true creatures of the crisis atmosphere of 1932 to 1933. The two other creatures of that crisis, Roosevelt and Hitler, shared a devotion to the soil and a belief that their nations could be redeemed by merging with it. First, they both established control over agriculture. In the United States, through the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933, and in Germany, through the Estate for Agriculture, the national government decided how much farmers would produce and how much they would charge for it. Roosevelt and Hitler both saw the family farm as the root of national virtue. For the president, the country was the only place to establish a real home in the traditional American sense. For the Führer, peasants were the foundation and life source of Germany and the source of national fertility. As governor of New York, Roosevelt established a program to pay for city families to move to farms so that they may secure through the good earth and permanent jobs they have lost in overcrowded cities and towns. As president, he launched a program designed by Tugwell called Subsistence Homesteads, which provided families with a modern but inexpensive house and outbuildings, located on a plot of land upon which a family may produce a considerable portion of the food required for home consumption. Likewise, the Nazis subsidized the construction of homes in rural areas in order to encourage self-sufficiency and to alleviate overcrowding in the cities. In Italy, one of Mussolini's most ambitious projects was the draining of a 300-square-mile marshland near Rome and the establishment of independent family farms on the reclaimed land. As the German cultural historian Wolfgang Schivelbusch has written, fascism, National Socialism, and the New Deal all made the garden settlement into a cornerstone of their plans for a new form of civilization, feeding popular enthusiasm with appealing words, images, and projects. Roosevelt's favorite New Deal initiative was the Civilian Conservation Corps, also created in 1933, which placed young men in military-style camps and put them to work in the nation's hinterland. The Nazis, too, improved much of the German countryside through the labor of youth housed in work camps. There was, furthermore, little difference in appearance or intent, according to John Garrity, between the Nazi work camps and those set up in America under the Civilian Conservation Corps. Roosevelt praised the CCC for getting young men off the city street corners. Hitler said the Nazi work camps saved German youth from rotting helplessly in the streets. Both the New Dealers and Nazis designed the programs to shape young men into citizen soldiers. The U.S. Army was put in control of the hundreds of thousands of volunteers who enlisted in the CCC. Corpsmen were required to stand at attention, to address their superiors as Sir, and to attend morning and evening flag-raising ceremonies. One corpsman remarked in a letter home, "The engineers and technicians teach us to be soil soldiers, a name they call us here, because we are the army who are training to repel the enemies of the land." Toward the end of the 1930s, as America moved closer to war, this militarization of youth became the undisguised purpose of the CCC. In 1940, Congress mandated non-combat military training for all CCC enrollees. The director of the program, James J. McEntee, explained that the military emphasis was necessary for converting unemployed young men without work experience into strong, vigorous young men who could drive trucks, trailers, which are the first cousins to tanks, build roads, bridges, telephone lines, which would aid in the advancement of industrial defense and in the strengthening of the military forces. The New Dealers, Mussolini, and Hitler were united in the belief that the conditions of the working class had to be greatly improved. The fascist and Nazi regimes outlawed trade unions, but they worked hard to make factories safer, cleaner, and more pleasant workplaces, and also provided subsidized housing, low-cost vacations, and sports programs to millions of German workers. In the U.S., more money was spent on public works projects than on any other part of the New Deal. The Works Progress Administration, established in 1935, was the largest such program. It made up half the federal budget and employed an average 2.1 million workers per year between 1935 and 1941. WPA workers built highways, roads, sidewalks, libraries, schools, stadiums, parks, airports, sewage treatment plants, bridges, and swimming pools. Of the three regimes, the Third Reich was the most effective in delivering a new life to the workers. The Nazis instituted a full employment program that within 3 years of Hitler's rise to power had virtually eliminated unemployment in Germany. A massive public works project, the Reichsarbeitsdienst, rivaled the WPA in size and scope. Functioning as a military-like unit, the RAD built the Autobahn, countless surface roads and bridges. It reclaimed marshland for cultivation, constructed dikes, improved drainage systems, and completed vast tree removal operations. During the war, the RAD constructed bunkers, underground facilities, and entrenchments all over Europe. In both the U.S. and Germany, government-sponsored employment programs were in large part directed toward military purposes. The Nazis put hundreds of thousands of Germans to work building weapons, planes, and tanks. In the U.S., workers employed by the Public Works Administration built 2 aircraft carriers, 4 cruisers, several smaller warships, more than 100 fighter planes and bombers, close to 50 military airports, and an Air Force headquarters. The German and American public works programs served another important function too. They regimented large portions of the American and German workforces and inculcated national cultures of discipline, order, sacrifice, and loyalty to the state. It is striking to see how similar were the ways in which the New Dealers and Nazis promoted their programs. In the thousands of posters produced by both governments, loyalty to the state frames the messages. Work is extolled as a means to dignity. Masculinity and manual labor are glorified, and homoerotic overtones abound. There was a widespread belief in both nations that the dissolution of the family in the sexually liberated 1920s was both a cause and a result of social disorder. Consequently, New Dealers and Nazis undertook massive propaganda campaigns to promote motherhood and merge it with the national interest. According to the manifesto of the Nazi Women's Organization, to be a woman means to be a mother, means affirming with the whole conscious force of one's soul the value of being a mother and making it a law of life. The German law to reduce unemployment of 1933 replaced women workers by funding work projects and occupational training programs that excluded women. Likewise, under the New Deal, federal and state governments were given the power to enforce motherhood. The Social Security Act of 1935, a major piece of legislation in the so-called Second New Deal, and one of the few to survive into the 21st century, included an old-age pension system and an unemployment insurance program. Because the unemployment and pension programs excluded domestic workers, most women who worked were excluded from work-related government aid. The Social Security Act was designed to give aid to only a certain kind of woman, a woman who contributed to the nation as a producer of workers, soldiers, and citizens. The law established aid to dependent children, a welfare program intended to keep mothers in the home. According to the committee that drafted the ADC provision in the law, it was designed to release from the wage-earning role the persons whose natural function